Is Harry Potter a classic book? Or will the Harry Potter series ever be classic books? That's a question you will find on numerous forums and I came across on Facebook just the other day. And in this video, we're going to take a look at whether or not Harry Potter will ever be a classic. And believe me, this is not just an opinion piece. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? Now, to determine whether Harry Potter will ever be a classic book, or any book that you like for that matter becoming a classic, we need to understand what makes a classic book. Because if we don't know that, there's no criteria for judging what's going to be a classic. And there's a lot of videos made about this. I've made one in the past, and they can often leave you up in the air with some sage comments, but you still can't quite put your finger on it. So for instance, a lot of videos will quote Italo Calvino's essay on what makes a classic, where he has 14 criteria. And one of the comments that he makes about a classic is that it is a book that has not exhausted all it has to say to its reader. That sounds very profound and insightful. He also says it's a book that always gives you a sense of discovery when you read it again. Other essays and other great publishing houses who have written on this will say things like a great classic has to have an enduring and brilliant protagonist and has to deal with the human condition, a deep dealing with the human condition. This all sounds good, but it actually doesn't hold up with some classics. For instance, if you've read Treasure Island, has it not exhausted all it has to say when you read it again? Or the third time or the fourth time? It exhausts itself. If you were to think of The Three Musketeers, pretty much the same thing could be said. Brilliant book, but has it exhausted all it has to say? Is it a profound detailing of the human condition? I'm not so certain about that. And what about the Agatha Christie novels, which are classics in mystery writing? I mean, has that talked about the human condition? I wouldn't say so. It's more like the sensationalist novels of the 19th century. But nonetheless, there's something about Agatha Christie that is just enduring. So it's not quite these profound, witty sayings that determines a classic. But there is someone who wrote an essay called Arnold Bennett. He of the How to Live on 24 Hours a Day fame. And I think he actually strikes the most accurate reason for why a classic is a classic. He talks about two different categories. He talks about the majority, that's the majority of readers around the world, the average public, and then the passionate few. And we're going to just talk about each of them. Now, he says of the majority that the majority will never establish what a classic is. It's beyond their capabilities because they haven't got a refined and developed taste in literature. They don't truly know what they like. And he doesn't mean to be condescending. He's just saying I'm being pragmatic. Now, think about this. Today, the majority of people, in the West at least, read about one book a year, maybe even less. How refined can their taste be on what they're reading? In fact, if you were to ask someone who doesn't read much what they read 2 years ago, they might not remember, or they may not be able to have a deep opinion about or a deep recall of what they read. And if they were to read it a couple of years later, they may actually think, oh, I don't like that anymore, because their taste is not sufficiently developed to be established. It's a bit like, have you seen the psychological test with the two wine bottles? People go into a supermarket and the test was set up. They put 2 bottles of wine, a £200 bottle and a £7 bottle next to each other. And they gave everyone samples to ask them if they could tell the difference, if they could taste the difference. And of course, everyone was saying, oh yes, the £200 one, definitely. And then afterwards they were told, well, we've actually swapped the wines over in the bottles. What you've been praising is the cheap wine. Now, why do people succumb to it? Yes, it's because the price tag's there, but it's because they haven't got a developed taste on wine. They don't know what they're looking for, really. If you were to send a professional sommelier into that test, they would have picked the cheap wine because their taste is established. And they may have had a thought, tasting this is a £200 wine, not 7. They've switched the wines. Do you see how taste works? And that's what Bennett says the majority do. They know when they're pleased with something, and that's why they can establish the reputation of a book right there and then. But they can't establish a classic because their taste changes. In fact, an example of that, if you left it to the average person, do you think Shakespeare would still be read today? Probably not. Do you think much poetry by Keats and Wordsworth would be read today? Absolutely not. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Eliot, Austen? Probably not. So how on earth have these books lasted if the majority haven't formed a taste to really keep them going? Well, it's very simple. It's down to the passionate few. That's what Bennett calls them. The passionate few, it doesn't mean like 10 or 20 people. You know, in the world today, the passionate few would probably be in the hundreds of thousands. But they are people who love literature. They love story. They love words. They love style. They love the way things are played with. They love imagination. They love being explored themselves through the book. And they are ardent readers. They are voracious. They're always looking for the new great story that will, pleasure them and satisfy them deeply. And this is why, people who love reading tend to go and get a degree in literature. They don't go and get a degree in mechanics because that's what they're interested in. So likewise, the mechanic goes to mechanics because he prefers engineering than literature. That's fair. We all have choices. But these passionate few, because they're reading all the time, they develop a strong sense of what is pleasurable. They begin to understand it almost instinctively. And because they're always on the search for a new book to please them, what happens is, if they're reading a book which is a poor book, they know it and they just stop. But they will start going to books that other passionate readers have mentioned. And here's the interesting thing about certain books. Sorry about that, doorbell went, I just had to go and answer it. So the thing about the passionate few, which is remarkable, is how frequently they come to agree on the same books through time that are really, really good. Now, they don't necessarily agree on every single one, but they are normally outliers. Overall, they appreciate the same books. Now, the way to think of this is like MasterChef. You've seen MasterChef. You get a group of aspiring chefs who are maybe quite passionate about it at home, or maybe they're even in a profession where they cook, but now they want to go to another level. And their dishes are presented before whom? They're presented before food critics and before Michelin-rated chefs. These are people who have become very refined in their taste. Now, what do you find about the critics and the chefs? Overall, they tend to agree quite easily on whose was the best dish. They agree whether something is well cooked or badly cooked. They tend to agree overall on flavour combinations. Sometimes they're surprised and they're delighted by it. And in MasterChef, there's often a scene, an event where they cook for a whole room of Michelin-rated chefs. All of them will end up saying the same thing about the dishes, what they like, what they dislike. Why are they in so much unison? It's because they have the most refined taste in food. And they know what good taste is, and so they tend to all agree. The same is true with classic books. The passionate few have read so much, come to appreciate words so much, delight in story so much, that when they pick up a classic, for instance, if they didn't know it was a classic, they'd read it and they'd be like, this is amazing. And then they'd want to talk about it. And this is how it gets into popular culture then. How does it endure? The classics only endure because the passionate few won't let the majority lose sight of them. They keep holding them up and saying, this author is a great author. Charles Dickens is brilliant. His works are brilliant. He's a master. And the majority, the average person, they only care very limited in books, as much as they're interested in, a TV show or whatever. And so if someone who is passionate about it keeps saying, these are the best books, they'll end up taking that on board. You've heard the phrase, keep saying a lie enough and people will believe it. Well, if you say the truth enough, people will believe it. And so when you say, what do you think of George Eliot, or what do you think of Shakespeare? Oh, fantastic, wonderful, brilliant. Moby Dick, great book. A lot of people won't have ever read it, but they've heard the passionate few say it. And so this is Arnold Bennett's main thrust. And he's not wrong at all. The thing that ultimately makes a classic is the passionate few who are always digging around looking for a book that pleases them. The key at the bottom is sheer pleasure. And if that comes through enlightenment, if that comes from the deep exploration of the human being, which is what makes the greatest classics, so be it. But there are plenty of books, like Du Maurier's book. Think of Rebecca, for instance. And then I mentioned Agatha Christie at the beginning. You read them and they just give you so much pleasure. The passionate few will talk about them, will recommend them, and they are in the positions, they end up in the publishing houses, and they know that these will be popular with readers. That's how a book becomes a classic. One other thing Bennett says is that the majority will be able to make the reputation of a book, but never be able to sustain it. And this is where Harry Potter comes in, or any book that you may particularly like. Society can praise a book in its day because it fits society's take on things, because a fad took off. And so that book can become enormously popular, and you just think this has got to be a classic then. However, as time goes on, will the passionate few readers read Harry Potter and go, oh, this is just wonderful. It's just scintillating. It doesn't have to be an exploration of the human condition, because if it was based purely on that, I wouldn't say Harry Potter would succeed. But how much pleasure is it going to give to future generations? Because they may feel differently about things. The classics, all passionate readers, they recognize their value, and that's why they last. To demonstrate the truth of this, let me ask you a key question. Have you ever heard of the author William Black? Probably not. And yet, at the late 19th century, William Black was immensely, maybe the most popular author in Britain at the time. He wrote lots of books, and yet today we don't know of him. Why is that? It's because the majority reading public, they move and sway with currents and flavours of the year or month. And the passionate few, they haven't found sufficient pleasure and satisfaction in William Black's works to keep bringing them to the attention of the majority of the public. And so that's the answer to our question. Will Harry Potter be a classic? The answer? Only time and the passionate few will tell. But it does actually give us a little other insight into academia as well. Because today, some people worry that the classics are being gotten rid of and cancelled, and diversity and inclusivity is pushing other books to be studied at universities, and that all the classics are going to be lost. Well, it won't, not according to Arnold Bennett's way of looking at things. Because although I agree diversity should be included in literature, because it's hard to get notice as more and more books are made, and it's good to see the perspectives of other people, the truth be told, the books that are held up and popular today because of those feelings, that worldview, that will change in years to come. In 50 years, people will not be thinking the same as they do today. And the passionate readers will still only be digging for books that give them deep pleasure, deep satisfaction, and they will raise them up and say, read this, read this. And that means lots of works you see today that seem to be popular, even in academic circles, will just fall by the wayside. Some of them, though, will stick. And that's how classics get established. And really, unless you have a totalitarian regime, the classics will always come through. Well, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and please consider sharing this with any reading group that you're with, because I think readers will really enjoy this video. It gives quite a bit of insight into the topic that we all enjoy so much. I want a quick shout out for a frequent commenter on this channel, Duffy, because Duffy keeps me on my toes. You know who you are. She once said when talking about the classics that to try and guess what book will become a classic is a fool's errand. And that's quite right. Only time and the passionate few will tell. But still, it's enjoyable to try and guess which books might become classics. So, until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.